Yep, you are ready to go, Calvin.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Calvin Lee, Executive Director of IMAA, and I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar this morning. Unprecedented times yields unprecedented measures. This is the first time that we've had our regional meetings as a webinar, and thank God for technology that we can do it this way. As we start our program this morning, as we do with all of our meetings, I'd like to remind you of our antitrust policy. I know that questions and answers will be a part of this, so we always make sure that we don't talk about certain things like pricing and contracts and things like that. So just want to mention that and ask you to honor that. We're also, I guess, fortunate in our state. We have been monitoring what's going on around the country as it relates to construction projects and each state's ability to continue with their projects. Indiana is definitely one state that, through executive order, our governor deemed construction and mining as essential. And so our operations will continue at this time. However, we want to focus on doing it in a safe manner. There's been lots of information that has come out about safe procedures, and we have some available on our website if you'd like to go there and take a look at some of those best practice type things. There's some really good ones. Just looking at some of them this morning that you want to be cognizant of as you complete your work on a daily basis. Even in the IMAA office, we are using best practices by limiting our time in the office, using our availability to work remotely, and just keep our staff safe. And in addition to that, I think you have received some information about how we're operating as regard to our committee meetings. We are definitely planning to continue providing the service and services that you have grown to recognize from our association and expect. We are planning all of our committee meetings, but they will be done via Zoom. So April starts our committee meetings over for the year. So please monitor the emails and meeting notices that will come out that we will be having our meetings. The other best practice that we are looking into and day extension for safety training, refresher training only. Um, a new minor training is something totally different, and they're not granting any extensions for that. So we want to try and keep everyone safe the best we can, and that's how we're doing that. Um, so with that being said, I think I covered the points that I wanted to cover this morning, just to welcome you and kind of give you the lay of the land as far as how IMAA is moving forward. So as far as this program is concerned, I'm going to turn it over now to Katie Allison, our office manager. She'll be serving kind of as our engineer for our programming today, and she'll give you some operating procedures to follow. Thank you, and please be safe.
All right. Thank you very much, Calvin. I have a couple of housekeeping things to go over for everyone as part of this webinar. The first one being the CAPP recertification portion of this. Everybody that is logged in as an attendee right now, your login will count as your attendance to this meeting. We have a list of all of those people. We also will have a link at the end of the webinar where if more than one person is watching from your screen, you can put in everybody's name and email, and they will also get credit for watching this webinar live. So I'm actually going to drop that link down in the chat here in just a minute, where everybody can also have, and I'll do that periodically in the chat. I'll drop the link so that you can enter in people's names. We are also recording this webinar, so we will be posting this at a later date on our website and our YouTube page for you to watch, or if there's anybody that you have that needs recertification that missed this meeting, they can watch this. INDOT will also have a short quiz that goes along with this. So you can watch and then send in your quiz, and you'll be counted as having completed your recertification portion. I also want to point out that there is a chat function along the side on the desktop version or even the mobile version. All panelists can see the chat, so we will be able to either drop things in that chat that we feel are important, or if you have things that you want to bring up, maybe you can't hear somebody clearly, you can chat along the side. There's also a little chat bubble that says Q&A. That's our question and answer section. We'll be taking questions and answers throughout this whole thing, where you can put in your questions. You'll have the opportunity to upvote questions if you see something that in particular that you really want answered. I do want to point out that there is, I believe you should see that there's an all questions section and a my questions section. So you can check to see if your question in particular has been answered. We'll be using this Q&A and the chat to compile a document later on that is going to answer some of these questions, and we'll send that out as well. And we're going to leave about 10 minutes towards the end for any unanswered questions that you guys may have. I also just want to point out that the HMA session will start at 11 o'clock. This webinar will not carry over into the HMA session, so we'll close out this webinar, and then you'll have to rejoin if you are also participating in the HMA session. And it will be a very similar format. There will be a Q&A, chat, and we'll have video and audio as well. So with all of that, I'm going to hand it over to Matt Beeson from INDOT, and he's going to do our preseason meeting.
All right, thank you, Katie. And here in a minute, as I figure this out, I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation. So welcome, everybody. I would have liked to have been seeing you in person, but instead I'm coming to you from my garage right here, and I can hear my kids are being really loud above me right now in their room. Hopefully you can't hear it. I'm sure some of you are in the same boat. Some of you are still working, and I appreciate everybody that's out there still going to work and making our construction program continue on through this difficult time. So let's see if I can get my screen shared here, and maybe. Okay. All right, so welcome. I would have seen some of you about 2 weeks ago down south. Was the originally scheduled meeting in the south. Today would have been the meeting in the central region of the state, and then we would have had one up north. Obviously, you're all here together virtually, and hopefully we can still take something away from this today. And I've got a few things I want to talk about. First off, in general, a update to our organization as far as INDOT goes, or as far as materials goes, since the last time I talk to a lot of you. I talk about CAPP update. I do have in here, I don't have it on my slides because I've only added it recently, an update on the coronavirus situation and how it relates to what we're doing at INDOT. Some spec changes, test method changes, and then some discussion of future concepts and other things we're working on. All right, so this is a snapshot of our INDOT's org chart. Up at the top there, you see the commissioner, Joe McGinnis, and I wanted to show this this is our current executive staff, and I wanted to show this because Roland Fagan, fairly recently, maybe about a year and a half ago, became the deputy commissioner for my group, for our group in construction and materials, and that's the next one I want to show you here. And the reason I wanted to show this is because after my former boss, John Leckie, left, there was a little confusion as to who reported to who and how the org chart was laid out. So I believe I had the same chart if you're at the IMAA winter workshops, but a lot of you probably weren't. So essentially, John used to be both kind of a combined position of the construction and materials management director. They split that up at some point last year. And now Greg is the director of construction management, also chief engineer, and then I am director of materials. So we both of us there. And then this is our group out there at materials. And I'm the director. I wanted to point out Jim Ryleman replaced me as state materials engineer. He has been assistant state materials engineer for the past couple of years. And then there's the rest of my direct report. So I don't want to spend too much more time on that, but I just wanted to share with you, for those of you that maybe were a little confused over the last year. I've had some requests to go through that because honestly, that's not. I wish we made some of those things a little more public, but it's hard to find some of that information unless you ask. So another organizational update. We are in the process of creating what we're calling our quality assurance group. So one of the things we've noticed for a few years, I've noticed, is that our independent assurance, and all of you have had some contact or interaction with independent assurance that come in and do your proficiencies or checkoffs, there can be a big difference between districts as far as how things are handled, how things are implemented. I've heard anecdotal stories about things doing maybe a little more conscientiously in other places than not. And so we've thought for a while we need to have a group at OMM whose main role is to monitor the activities of independent assurance, ensuring consistency, even providing training. That's one of the drawbacks, is as we transition into some of the longtime employees retiring, we have some new employees that could probably have used some training on a lot of our procedures, and we've not provided a great central training program for them. Have a central point of contact for questions that also handle, and that group would also handle our lab inspection. So that's a new group. There'll be about 3 employees, and we're working on rolling that out. We've been doing that for the past few months. I also want to touch on Failed Materials Committee, and as it relates to aggregates, it's not always something, probably the asphalt industry and maybe the concrete industry is a little more directly involved with things. We have failed materials, but we do have some aggregate failed material issues that come up. And this is another thing that is fairly new over the last couple of months. We've held one official meeting. We were going to have another one last week until essentially life stopped, or meetings stopped, I should say, due to the coronavirus. But this is another thing we are rethinking and reforming because of maybe some past issues of consistency and how things operate. So for many years, we had called it the Failed Materials Committee. We had not met routinely as a committee. In recent memory, part of it was to streamline operations, but what happened over the years was we ended up with it became a lack of transparency, I guess, so to speak. And I don't think that there was any sense of impropriety. It was just people would not know what was going on with the failed material issue. It would go down to OMM in Indianapolis, and it would come out the other end, and people didn't know what was going on in between and how decisions were being made. So we wanted to reform it, have monthly meetings, and also expand a little bit, because we have some ongoing investigations that are not necessarily a quote unquote failed material that might need a ruling by somebody in central office, as opposed to letting each district maybe handle something on their own. So we also expanded the reach of it. We have a member from design, materials, construction, and asset management, and then myself as the chair, and we're planning on having a secretary at some point that we have not filled yet. So, and then all appeals will go to Greg Pankow. As a bit of a spinoff of this discussion, it kind of started off as the Failed Materials Committee discussion. We're also forming something called the INDOT Strategic Steering Committee, where we'll be talking about a lot of big issues, you know, among other things. As an example from the aggregate side of things, over the past few years, we've had a lot of discussions of what to do with the drainage layers on our various, under our various pavements. And there has been if you talk to different divisions at INDOT, you might get different answers as to the direction that we want to go. That's just one example. There's a number of others, and we want to be able to have a central group that can kind of talk about big issues and set a direction for INDOT. All right, so moving on to CAPP school. We had our CAPP school last November, which now seems so bizarre that we were ever able to gather in large groups, but we did. We had our CAPP school. It was successful again. I want to thank everyone who contributed and participated. We had a few more failures this year. I don't know why. The program was pretty similar from 2018, but it just happens that way. We did only have 3 that passed the retake that attempted it. So we'll be continuing on to make some updates. I know there's some updates to the statistical section, chapter 10, that are still ongoing. That tends to be a point of difficulty for some attendees, but I do want to say thank you to all that participated. So there's a reason, I guess a lot of you are logged on today because we did make a big change to how CAPP technicians are going to get recertified, and it was been alluded to by Katie, but I'll talk about it. So in the past, the way it would work, you go to CAPP school and you need to stay recertified by either doing 3 years in a row of proficiencies, and well, that essentially became a point of question after INDOT moved to only doing proficiencies every other year. So what are we going to do? And does it really matter anyway? Does it prove that you're staying updated with the latest changes just to be able to prove you can do the same test method over and over year to year? The other option would be to come in and retake an exam. We had the same questions with that as to whether does it really prove anything that a person can come in and take a very similar, I don't want to say identical, but maybe almost identical exam every 3 years to be recertified. And so what do we do? We'd like to have a way to make sure people don't just get certified once at CAPP school and never get any updates. What's the best way to do it? And so we thought that this would be there's a lot of good information. We hope there's good information, at least, that we share at these regional meetings, or in this case, a regional webinar or statewide webinar, I guess. And so we thought, okay, let's have the technicians to get recertified. You have to attend this meeting every year. If you can't make it, as Katie said, we'll have a recording of it, and you'll just have a little quiz to take to prove that you watched it. So that's the change. And obviously today, so if you're a CAPP technician and you're here today, you are getting recertified. You'll be recertified by the end of the webinar, I guess. I will say next year we're going to return to in-person meetings. At least I'd really like to. I know hopefully this is successful, but this is no substitute for actually being out there and interacting and seeing everyone in person. So I suppose I should knock on wood. I guess next year, hopefully we're not still all quarantined with the virus. I would have gone crazy by then. But this is the plan going forward. So I do want to point out, for more information, you can go to our website, and they've changed the design of our website a bit, so it's not quite exactly as it used to be, but you should be able to click around by going to INDOT or in.gov/INDOT, and then you can go to doing business with INDOT, contractors, construction, materials management information. So that's how you get to the materials page. At the very top there's a thing called testing memorandums and current testing memos, and there is actually a testing memorandum on this topic, and there's a link up there at the top on all of the certified technician certification changes. And so you can see a snapshot of the first half of it there. So one of the big, I think, points of confusion is this does not mean if you're working at an aggregate source that you no longer need to do proficiency. We still will do, still be coming out to do proficiencies. IA will still be visiting you. It just will be every 2 years now rather than every year. And it won't tie into recertifying you for CAPP. So it's essentially a two-part system. The proficiencies can prove to us that you are able to run a test proficiently, and the meetings like today will prove that you can stay up on all of the information and changes to specs and test methods that occur on a yearly basis. I will add one more thing. The technician list is now online. If you go to the same page I was just at and go, maybe I think it's about 2/3 of the way down, you can see for our CAPP program and also for the asphalt programs that we put on, we now have our technician list available online. I think we will be working on improving the look of that over time. But now if you need to see when if you're currently certified or not, you can log on and look yourself rather than having to ask somebody at INDOT. I know for years we'd been afraid of putting that on, would it be a quote unquote a shopping list or things like that if somebody needed a technician they could start going down a list of people. But it was pointed out to us that some other states have done this for years and that's not a problem there. And honestly, I think people know who's certified at other sources. So really, this is to benefit the individual technicians just to check to see if you're being recognized by INDOT as currently certified or not. Let's see. All right, so on to the coronavirus. I saw a thing. I'm not going to take credit for it. I've been seeing a lot of these things posted on various things like Facebook, but me being born in the 80s, this fit. It said I've now been alive in 6 decades: the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, the 2020s, and March 2020. Because March 2020 has felt like its own decade. It's amazing to think that sports was still going on like 3 weeks ago, because that seems about like 3 years ago now. So here we all are, and I wanted to talk a little bit about INDOT and our response to and how we're handling the issues with coronavirus. So as of right now, all INDOT contracts are proceeding as planned. If you're watching this as a recording in May or something, you might either laugh at us for saying that things are still open or laugh at us for closing everything. I don't know, but obviously this is subject to change because everything is subject to change at this point in our life. So, but we are still right now planning on delivering the contracts as bid. We're moving forward with lettings and all of that. And I know there's been some questions that have come up with budget and funding and things like that. As of now, all these projects are funded. I can't speak to future. I don't think anybody can either, because we don't have a crystal ball as to what it's going to mean for the future. But for now, we are full, all system go. Okay, so what does that mean though for our testing departments in the district and at OMM? We are supporting critical functions only. So we obviously, a lot of the field construction personnel still have to be out in the field. However, at INDOT, most of the office staff, most of the administration staff have been sent home. So most of us are working from home. We are all available by phone and email, just as we have been before. Sometimes we might even be more available because we're in less meetings and just at home. I don't know. It depends on the person. But like I said, most of us are being deployed from home, save for a few people that are still stationed at our lab. So what are we doing? We are still going to keep testing HMA samples. We are doing critical trial batches for concrete. but this is more of a list of what we're not doing. So we're suspending or postponing any CAPP audits that were scheduled, any routine sampling from CAPP sources such as you know, annual qualities or whatever. We are postponing IA proficiencies and most of the field soils and aggregate samples. But that being said, we will be testing critical samples that need to get tested. We don't want to hold up any construction projects, and we also don't want to waive testing where there would be a risk of obtaining substandard material on a contract. So we are going to continue to test critical samples. The freezers at OMM are continuing to run. We're having personnel come in and operate those as needed. So we can get that information out to people that are waiting on it, and B, so we don't get behind. And these restrictions are until May 1st as of right now. So we'll be reviewing that as we go through April. We will consider exceptions. So if there's something that really needs to happen, you know, we're going to handle it on a case-by-case basis. So we want to make sure we're still getting quality materials. We want to make sure we have qualified personnel during the sampling and testing. So if IA does need to go out and somebody is brand new, that could happen. We'll review but we also want to ask everyone to if at all possible, find someone who's already qualified that can do the work. So we're going to make every effort to postpone and defer per the governor's recommendations and CDC and otherwise to socially distance ourselves from each other. But we're still going to support our suppliers and our contractors. So we may need to sample and test on a case-by-case basis. And I just want to add this, we want to use common sense. So we're going to listen to each issue. Here, if there's something we need to go out and do, get a sample, run a test, do whatever we need to do to allow your operations to continue. But if it doesn't sound critical and it can wait, it probably isn't. So if it says if there's some chance that we can get the sample May 10th or June 10th or whatever the date is when, you know, we're able to go back out into the world again, then we can defer it until that time. So that's I'm going to move on past there, but there might be some questions that come in later on some other things like related to coronavirus, because I think it's in the front of all of our minds right now, and we can cover those when we get to it. So back to some regular old scheduled programming, I guess here. Some spec changes, some test method changes that have occurred over the last year, and they're really, from the spec change perspective, it's fairly minor, but I do want to cover it. This is a structure backfill type 3, which is used for MSE walls behind MSE walls, I believe. And there's a change down here about the ACBF. So if blast furnace slag is used, it shall only be used in sizes number 5 or number 8. That's a change that was made based on the feedback from the INDOT wall committee. And some other changes for the MSE wall structure backfill are here. I'm sorry, type 3 is changed, but if it's, okay, that change was for type 3. This change, I was getting my changes mixed up here. This is for the MSE wall structure backfill. We did not want to allow the use of blast furnace slag for the MSE wall structure backfill. So that was put into place for contracts led after September 1st of 2019. Another change here to the LWD compaction. This was something we went around and around with over a number of years with the IMAA committee, and as well as our geotechnical group. And we had a minor change here. It was a bit of a concern in the field over waiting for the soil or the aggregate to dry out, I should say. And so we struck this sentence here: the compaction of aggregate shall not occur if the moisture content is greater than 6. It still needs to be delivered per those other delivery requirements in that spec, but that just changes the field compaction moisture requirements. We had a clarification on friction aggregates, and so this came up for HMA surface mixtures. And if you can see there on the screen, we made there used to be a table a few years ago. We put it into a few paragraphs, and reading there, ESO Category 4 type D-surface mixtures, high friction aggregates including slag, ACBF slag, steel furnace slag, sandstone, or aggregates in accordance with 221 shall be used. And you could go down the screen, and we allow up to 50% by volume crushed dolomite or polished resistant aggregate, and then we also allow up to 20% of any crushed stone or gravel to be blended in with there. Well, the intent was it would be 50% of the high friction aggregate, and then if you wanted to use the crushed stone or gravel, that would cut into the other 50% of dolomite or polished resistant aggregate. It wasn't read by everybody that way, and I believe we had an HMA producer that was submitting mixed designs with 30% high friction aggregate and 70% of the other stuff, and that was not the intent. And so we added the sentence, or the phrase, and at a minimum shall comprise 50% by volume of the coarse aggregate. So that's going into effect for contracts let at the beginning of this month. All right, we made numerous changes to our blast furnace slag leachate determination. I know most of you on the phone this doesn't, or on the call doesn't affect, but I wanted to point it out there. We're working on ways to minimize leachate. There's another ongoing research study to look at an improved test method to more mimic what happens in the field. But these are the changes we made last year based on what we've learned so far. So we want to make sure we do not get samples from just the surface. We want interior samples. We used to allow up to a certain color based on a color scale of water after the test was done, as well as the pH testing. We decided to change that to say the water needs to be clear and colorless. And we also extended the test to a total of 15 days rather than ending at 7 days. So those were a few changes we made to attempt to improve and not get any leachate when we use blast furnace slag in an unbound condition. Okay, this is one recent change that just happened last month. And there's been a few industry members asking when we can, or when is INDOT going to implement the use of the so-called go, no-go gauge for verifying sieves. Up until now, we've only allowed calipers. I think as a department, we are still reviewing whether or not we want to do that for our own usage, but we do understand for your usage, it can be beneficial, faster, et cetera. And so ITM 902 now has an option. In the interest of, I guess, not ballooning a procedure and not tying you down to one procedure that we would write, especially because this is not necessarily recognized by AASHTO yet either. We decided to do it this way, to where if an industry member would like to use a go, no-go gauge as part of, for checking sieves, they need to develop a method and put it in their quality control plan, and we will review and approve that method. So more or less, you need to make your own in-house method for how you're going to do that. It doesn't have to be extremely formal. It just needs to be a method that you can follow across all the sieves that you're checking, and we will take a look at that and review that. So that's the change that is in effect right now for ITM 902. Okay, so we did get some new freezers. I mentioned the freezers earlier are running, which is great because with the old freezers, you never know whether they were running or not at any given time because we had so many maintenance issues with them. So we about 3 or 4 years ago, we added up all the costs that we were incurring to keep the Punzac freezers running that were about 25 years old now, or maybe even a little older than that. And we were spending, over the course of a few years, we had spent $80,000, I believe, just keeping both of them running. Because these are not cheap things, but when we looked at that and said, hey, you know what, let's invest in some new ones. And so we did. We were on the waiting list for a few years with Scientemp. They, I think the way I understand it, there's a couple of guys that build these up in Michigan. And so essentially it took a long time, took us a few years. We finally got them, installed them. They're operational. We have been doing some comparisons with the concrete AP freezer. I think we are still, we've compiled a lot of information. The concrete freezer, as far as I know, the Punzac is still technically operational, although we're phasing down with that. But we do have some good comparisons between the old and new freezer for the AP that we can compile and share at a future technical committee meeting. Okay, so the future. A few things I want to talk about going forward. I really want to improve this friction aggregate acceptance process. So it still stands today where we need to do a test strip for both of our PRA, ITM 214, and high friction aggregate test products that get approved. And that, I mean, it's a big investment on the sources, both in money and in time. I mean, at least a couple of years from start to finish. That's not the most efficient way to do things. We're fairly confident that we can move to use the procedure that's used in ITM 221, the polishing wheel procedure, to validate this, but we do need to do a final round of research to follow up on some of our earliest test sections that are placed out there to make sure that we have good correlation. One other thing we did not do with the last round of research was it was tough that we put the request out there. It's tough to find people that are making mix designs on asphalt mix designs with aggregates that polish because we don't allow it per our specs. And so we really need to be able to test some mixes that have polishing aggregates to make sure that we are able to discern between highly polishing and polish resistant aggregates. So that will be coming. I'm going to cross my fingers that research will get funded this go around. It just below the cut line, but hopefully we can get that moving so we can move on with this process. Okay, so one other, and this is probably the biggie, I guess, that's been discussed a lot in various circles on the aggregate. Well, I mean, really everybody. This ended up being, we had a meeting back in December, and we had the aggregate industry, the concrete industry, the asphalt industry, and INDOT all in the same room, which doesn't happen very often. But talking about what we want to do with optimized concrete aggregate. So we're trying to improve concrete performance. You've heard it called the tarantula curve. It's the same thing. We're trying to optimize the aggregate. And so this is a picture of it. Concrete people tend to talk in percent retained. I know we get used to percent passing, but it's essentially each sieve and each percent retained. And the concept is if you can get a gradation for a concrete that plots in that curve that you see there, then you will get some really good outcomes. So I'll talk about a few of those. So what can we solve by optimization while issues prior to set and as well as long term? So it's really there's a lot of good things that can come by meeting that tarantula curve for your concrete aggregate gradation. It makes it easier to finish. So the finishers aren't having to do crazy things. I love that picture. I stole that from Mike Nelson. That's a great one. But I guess finishers, they will go the extra mile. Apparently, we want to make their job easier because then that gives us more durable concrete in the long run. We have and then workability. So if we're talking about pavement concrete, we can have an issue where if you have a mix that is not optimized, and this is an example of one, you can see it charted there, and this is a core from that pavement. This is a real project in Indiana. Then it's not going to close behind the paver. It's not going to consolidate where the vibrators are in the paver there, and you end up with problems where voids in the. We have some of these sections where these voids run for thousands of feet, and it was all. We've tied it all back to if the mix was not workable enough. It met our specifications as of the time this was placed, as far as the gradation, I should say. But it was not optimized. We feel like if it had been an optimized gradation, it would have prevented it. This is another example of a barrier wall. You can see a crack that occurred there, consolidation around the rebar, and the mix was just too harsh and ended up leading to that crack. And this was a core we took to investigate that. So. Can also lead to shrinkage cracking on decks, and then after placement, low strength scaling, etc. So there's a lot of win-win things that can come from this. And I want to say, are we getting bad concrete? Well, no, not really, not across the board. There are some examples I showed of some issues, but we could be doing better, and we could be doing it for all of our concrete, both pavement and structural. But how do we get there? It's not it's not been as easy as just flipping a switch or snapping our finger. So about 3 years ago, we decided to put out and actually I say all concrete pavement here is actually for all concrete pavement and structural concrete. We had a draft series of spec changes that would have just required this. And I will say that kicked off much discussion. There were a lot of meetings that ensued out of this. And we were quickly informed and told it was not going to be as easy as just changing a couple lines in a spec to say, give us a tarantula gradation. So how is industry, both the aggregate industry and the concrete industry, going to deliver this to us? It sounds like a minor change, but it ended up being a complex series of discussions as to what do we do. I think a lot of people also said, well, that's great, but this is a great idea, but the other industry or another industry can adjust for what INDOT would like to do. And so what do we do? And so last year we've been going along with this. We've actually done a trial project where one pavement contractor has worked with the aggregate supplier on a big job to do this. But as far as across the board spec change, as of last year, we're still talking about it. And the question came up of, well, the Indiana 8s. It was brought up at a meeting with the ready mix industry of, what are we doing? INDOT is specifying 8s, but why do we really want 8s? And what do I mean by that is our program, our CAPP program says, hey, you aggregate suppliers, you give us some 8s and thumbs up, everything's good. We have no problems. You're doing a great job. And then we are trying to turn around and tell the concrete suppliers that, hey, don't use those 8s because those mixes aren't optimized. Because when you take a typical Indiana 8 gradation, blend it with our typical 23 sand that we have in this state, it does not give us a tarantula optimized aggregate. So INDOT asked the question to the concrete industry and said, okay, well, if 8s is not it, what gradation do you want? And the concrete industry proposed a new gradation back in October, and they did that and submitted to INDOT and IMAA. Numerous meetings and discussions ensued. There's a lot of concern about the concept we'd be replacing the 8s with this gradation. There was a lot of concern about how to make that happen, whether that's even feasible or not. That led to that big meeting I referred to in December, which also the asphalt industry was involved in. And I'd like to say they asked, hey, wait a minute, who moved my cheese? Because it would affect them also. And so we had a lot of discussions as far as what we should do. Should we have a couple of different gradations? Do we choose this on this other gradation on our high risk jobs, et cetera? And that's kind of where we're at with that alternate gradation proposal, or with the new gradation proposal. There's been an alternate option proposed, which is still in discussion stages, but it's one that could have some promise. Instead of having a statewide standardized gradation that we say this shall be the new concrete aggregate, there's been a discussion of could we have a program similar to ITM 225 for drainage layer aggregate, where a source submits a QA gradation that would be reviewed, tested, et cetera, approved by INDOT, and so there kind of be a customized QA gradation. We're still, I think the IMAA is still talking about that idea amongst themselves. I've kind of just gotten a little information about the concept. I think we're open to that concept, but we are still ongoing with where we want to go with that. So I think ultimately our goal is we'd love to have this in the next couple years. We're not trying to do this it can't be the flip of a switch, obviously, because we're talking about changing major operations. But we do feel that we get better materials, and hopefully if it costs a little more up front, we understand that. Hopefully over time the cost will stabilize, but we can see the benefits to it. I showed you a couple pictures there as to examples that we could have avoided, and so we really feel this is a great way to go, just to get the optimized concrete aggregate, the tarantula gradation. I think we all agree with that. We're just trying to figure out how to get there. So I'm confident we'll get there, as long as we keep working together, working through our any difficulties in moving forward with this. So with that being said, we are all in this together. So for those of you out there that are still at work, stay safe. For those of you that are home, stay safe too. When you're not working, stay home, follow the recommendations. That doesn't mean have parties where only 9 people are invited. You're supposed to stay home and not see people for now. So do all those things. We'll get through this fast. Look forward to seeing you all again in person soon. It's going to be crazy seeing real people again, other than your family, I think, for some of us that are sequestered at home with our family. So with that being said, that is the end of my planned presentation, and I guess I guess we'll take questions. And I've had the window open. I've not seen how many questions have come in. I can look at that now. I guess, Katie, are there any questions you think that haven't been answered or that need to be moved up the list here?
Matt, we had a question that when you were talking about the leachate
Yes.
from Stephen Kinsella, that I think Nathan kind of addressed it a little bit, but maybe you could talk about it a little bit more. It says, what about using coarse wrap in the Cat 3 surface in place of the fine wrap?
Okay, what about using a coarse wrap in the Cat 3 surface in place of the fine wrap? I see that now. I think the question would be, if it's related to that 20% provision where we allow 20% of any aggregate. I believe we have a statement. This is a good question for the asphalt side of things. I think that's a good that is a good point. I know we've talked about it, and I was thinking we had a provision for that, at least in some of our certain mixes, but it would make sense that if we can use 20% of any coarse aggregate, then you could certainly use coarse wrap from at that percentage also. Will the presentations from today be available as a PDF or other document for future review? Yes, we will make them available. It looks like somebody shared the link to the technician list. So that seems to be all the questions that I see that got sent in on the Q&A. Does anybody else, while we're still here for a few more minutes before a lot of us switch over to the asphalt webinar, does anybody have any other questions they want to ask? All right, I see one here. What happens to the current PRA test strips if the updated testing procedures are accepted? Do they still have to go through the 2 to 3 year waiting period? That will be a interesting transition. I don't know how that's going to look yet. Hopefully we can kind of intercept. If it's currently placed and going, I don't see us getting an updated procedure before the end of that 2 to 3 year waiting period. If it's already on the ground, meaning as of last year. If there's anything currently happening, the hard part is I don't want to call anything off right now because it's tough to transition from one method to another, and we don't have the method written and the research isn't done to be confident yet. So the answer to that is if it's ongoing, if it's been placed, we're still going to monitor that the old way. I'm not at a point yet where I can say hold off on test strips because I can't tell you when that method, the new method that I proposed a few minutes ago, will be live and ready to go. I got another question. Did the 200 sieve spec on 53s change? From Anonymous. I like that. All right. No, not yet. There had been some talk of the I forget whether it was our October meeting or which meeting it was, of having a different 200 sieve spec on 53s because the problem is some of our, depending on where you're at on that 200 sieve, you could be permeable, impermeable, and we really need those. We need permeable 53s for drainage. We need impermeable for separation. So there is a suggestion of having two different, kind of split the 53 gradation. That hasn't happened yet. So as of right now, the standard spec 53s are the same gradation as they've always been. Jerry, can you share with us who the person in the picture behind you? Well, if you're a Seinfeld fan, that is Kramer from an early episode of Painting. I forget honestly, I forget the details. I need to go watch the episode again. But that is I'm not related to Kramer. I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, I guess. Probably fortunately. All right. I guess we'll do the last call here for any more questions. We've got a few more minutes before we need to switch over. Why does INDOT not use a time decant instead of each person's opinion? Well, that's a good question. That's because that's what we've done, I guess. I do believe I've heard of that at some other locations. They use that time decant. There's a number of things that other locations do that we do differently, and I can't always answer why. Sometimes there's a good reason that was lost to time, so to speak. But that's a good question. I'll make a note of it. Thank you, Randy.
Matt, I did want to point out, I know there are a few people that may be phone only call-in listeners.
Okay.
That if you're only listening right now on your phone, I can only see your phone number, and therefore I don't have your name to be recorded for your attendance. So if you could please email me after this is over and let me know that you called in, and even give me your phone number, because I will be able to see who called in with their phone numbers. That would help me match up names to who was actually attending. So, and in case you don't have my email, it should have gone out with all of the confirmation emails for this webinar, but it's Katie, Katie, at INDMAA.org.
All right, there's a couple more questions here I will take, and then we'll cut it off. The new from Oleg, the new proposed spec 200 for two different 53 aggregates overlap. Do you see an issue with that? The proposal I saw did not. It was something like 0 to 8 for one product, and then something like 8 to 13 or something around that ballpark for the other one. At least that's the proposal I had seen, if that's what we're talking about, Oleg. So I think the idea is it would not overlap if we had two products. Another question, I heard there was going to be a push for 43s this year. Is there any truth to that? I have not heard from our pavement group that that's going to be the case. I do think we are using the aggregate drainage layer on a couple different projects. I have not heard of a renewed big push for 43s, but occasionally, as I mentioned earlier, very beginning, that's one of the things the strategic steering committee wants to handle, or wants to try to handle, so we're all on the same page. So I'm not sitting here in materials saying, well, heck, I don't know what pavement is doing, because I've had to say that a few times, and I don't. It would be nice to be able to have a unified INDOT answer. So I have not heard that, but that's a good question. Why do CAPP and ICAP people also need to take the INDOT written test, even though they passed the CAPP or ICAT exam? So that is something, actually historically they did not, but we made that change because the CAPP and ICAT both, and ICAT is the asphalt class, they focus on the kind of the bigger picture, the policies, procedures, the program, some of the, the math and the way we operate, things like that. The actual written tests that are for the qualified program focus on running that test itself. We don't cover that in CAPP. We don't cover exactly how to run each individual test, and so we decided a technician still needs to take those tests and then demonstrate their proficiencies. Eric Woodings, is 225 still being considered? Yes, that's still being used as far as I know. The question is, what is our pavement group doing with drainage layers? Okay. All right, so I think since we're about 10:55 here, let's go ahead and end this webinar. For those, as Katie said, for those of you that are attending the HMA one in 5 minutes, you need to log off of this one and log back into the other one. For those of you that are not, thanks for attending. And like I said, I hope to see you all again in person at some point this year, and then at these meetings in person again next year. So thank you.